my sister walked through my parents' front door with him, I remember thinking he was almost too polished, the kind of polish that takes practice. It was my dad's 70th birthday. My mom had spent 2 days cooking pierogies from scratch, the cabbage rolls she only makes for real occasions. A butter cake with the lemon glaze my dad pretends not to love but always takes a second slice of. The house smelled like it used to when we were kids, that specific warmth of a kitchen that hasn't stopped working since morning. I'd driven up from Toronto the night before, slept in my old bedroom with the squeaky floorboard outside the door, and woken up to Frost still sitting on the back fence. My husband was already downstairs when I came down. He had his coffee and was standing at the kitchen window watching the yard the way he sometimes does, quietly, like he's processing something he hasn't said out loud yet. He did 12 years with the RCMP before moving into federal financial crimes, and I used to tease him that he never fully leaves work. He'd just smile and say that wasn't a bad thing. My sister arrived around 2 in the afternoon. I heard the car first, then the front door, then her voice carrying down the hallway. She'd been seeing him for 8 months. I'd heard a lot about him, the practice in Vancouver, the colleagues he mentioned by name, the conference in Montreal he'd spoken at last spring. She had told our mom he was the kind of person who made her feel like she'd finally stopped settling. She was 31 and had spent most of her 20s putting everyone else first, and she said this like it was a door she'd finally allowed herself to walk through. He came in with a bottle of wine and a very good handshake and knew my dad's name immediately, used it twice in the first 2 minutes, which I noticed and then told myself to stop noticing. My husband shook his hand, said it was nice to meet him, and that was it. That was all. But something shifted. I didn't see it then. I saw it later, after dinner, when I came into the kitchen and found my husband rinsing dishes with that particular stillness he gets when his mind is somewhere else entirely. I asked if everything was okay. He looked at me for a moment like he was deciding something. The name he gave, he said, the clinic he mentioned. What about it? He handed me a dish towel and said, I want to look something up when we get home. I told him to stop being a detective at my dad's birthday party. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. We stayed the night. My parents live 4 hours from the city, and my mom always makes it hard to leave. And honestly, after a few glasses of wine and my dad's stories about the hardware store he'd run for 30 years, I didn't want to. My sister and her boyfriend took the guest room. I could hear her laughing at something through the wall before I fell asleep, and I remember feeling glad for her. She had been lonely for a long time in ways she didn't always name. On the drive back Sunday morning, my husband was quiet for the first hour. I was half asleep in the passenger seat watching the flat gray stretch of the 400 and drinking bad Tim Hortons coffee that had gone cold. I looked him up last night, he said. I sat up a little. When? After you fell asleep? I turned to look at him. He keeps his eyes on the road when he's about to say something he's been sitting with. The clinic he mentioned, the one in Kitsilano. I searched the College of Physicians and Surgeons at BC directory. He's not registered. Maybe he spelled it differently. I tried 4 variations. I didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, the trees had gone bare and the sky was that flat November white that makes everything feel a little unreal. Maybe he's registered in another province, I said. I checked Ontario too, and Alberta. He paused. And the National Register. I put my coffee cup in the holder and looked at my hands. Okay, I said slowly. What does that mean? I don't know yet, he said, but it means something. I want to say I acted immediately, that I called my sister that afternoon, or that I told my mom, or that I sat down and made a plan. I didn't. I told myself there was probably an explanation. Maybe he was in the process of relocating his license. Maybe there was a gap in the database. These things happen with bureaucratic systems. I knew that. I'd seen it with my own work in healthcare administration, the lag between paperwork and digital records. But I kept thinking about the handshake, the way he'd used my dad's name twice, the way my husband had gone quiet. I've been married for 6 years. I know the difference between him being tired and him being concerned. He doesn't alarm easily. He spent over a decade watching people lie professionally, and it takes something real to make him go still like that. A week passed, then another. My sister called me on a Tuesday night sounding happy, telling me about a trip they were planning to Portugal in the spring, asking if I thought she should take 2 weeks or 3. I said 3, obviously, and listened to her talk and said nothing. That night I asked my husband if he'd found anything else. He had. He'd spent a few evenings going through what he could access: public records, professional registries, court indexes. The man my sister was dating had a name that appeared in a British Columbia small claims filing from 3 years ago. A woman had taken him to court over a loan of $14,000. The case had been settled, the details sealed, but it was there. There was also a second name, not a different spelling, a different name entirely, with a different birth date attached to a social media profile that had since been deleted but had been archived. Same face, different history. "He's done this before," my husband said, not dramatically, just flat and certain the way he gets when the picture comes together. "This is a pattern." I sat with that for a long time. The hardest part wasn't knowing. It was knowing what telling her would cost. My sister and I are 18 months apart. People used to ask if we were twins, which we both hated for different reasons. She because she wanted to be seen as older, me because I wanted to be seen as myself. We fought constantly growing up in the particular vicious way that only siblings can, the kind of fighting that knows exactly where to press. And then in our 20s, something shifted, the way it sometimes does, and we became each other's first call. She had been through a hard stretch in her late 20s, a relationship that had ended badly enough to make her pull back from everything for almost a year. I'd watched her piece herself back together, slowly, stubbornly, the way she does everything, and I'd watched her open up again, cautiously, to the possibility of someone. I knew that telling her would feel to her like the ground giving out again. I also knew that not telling her was its own kind of betrayal. I called her on a Saturday morning when I knew she'd be alone. She always goes to the farmer's market by herself, says it's her one quiet hour of the week. I timed it so she'd be walking back, coffee in hand, a few blocks from her apartment. She answered on the second ring. "Hey, what's up?" Cheerful, a little distracted. "I need to tell you something," I said, "and I need you to let me get through it before you respond." She went quiet, that particular silence that means she's bracing. I told her everything, methodically, because I'd practiced it: the registry search, the small claims case, the second name. I told her my husband had been careful, had double-checked, had wanted to be certain before I said a word. I told her I was sorry. I told her I'd been sitting with this for 2 weeks, and it was the hardest 2 weeks I'd had in a long time. When I finished, there was a long pause. "You looked him up," she said. "My husband did, because something felt off." "Something felt off to your husband." Her voice had an edge I recognized, not the sharp kind, the brittle kind, the kind that means she's trying not to crack. "I know," I said. "I know this is not what you wanted to hear." "He has a practice," she said. "I've seen photos. I've spoken to his." "I know, and I'm not saying there's a simple explanation for the photos. I'm saying his name isn't in the registries, and there's a civil case, and there's a second identity." Another silence, longer. "You should have told me sooner," she said finally. "You're right, I should have." She hung up. She didn't call me back for 4 days. I gave her the space, even though every morning I woke up and checked my phone before I was fully conscious. My mom called on day 2 asking if something had happened between us, and I said we'd had a disagreement and needed a few days, which was technically true. On the 4th day, a Thursday, she texted me, "Can you come this weekend?" I drove up Friday night. She lived in a 1-bedroom in the west end of the city, the kind of apartment that's small but feels considered. She'd spent a lot of time on it: gallery walls and a kitchen with real knives and a little balcony she'd strung lights across. I'd always loved being in her space. She made things feel intentional. She made tea when I arrived, which in our family means we're going to talk about something real. She sat across from me at her small table and wrapped both hands around her mug and said, "I confronted him." I waited. I asked him directly about the registry. I told him I wanted to see his license, the actual physical license. She looked down at her tea. He said the database has a lag, that he just transferred his registration from Quebec, that it takes 6 to 8 weeks to update. Did you believe him? She was quiet for a moment. I wanted to. That's not the same thing. No, she said, it's not. She told me she'd asked one of her colleagues, she works in hospital administration, has for 5 years, to check internally. Not through the public registry. Through the back-end system that healthcare administrators can access, the one that cross-references active practitioners across provinces. He wasn't in it. Not under his name, not under any variation, not anywhere in the system. "He's not a doctor," she said. It came out very flat, like she'd already said it to herself 100 times and worn the shock off it. "I know," I said as gently as I could. 8 months, she said. "I paid for the Portugal flights. We split them, but I paid for mine on my visa." She paused. "He borrowed money from me in September. He said it was a gap between transfers. His bank accounts were in a different province and there was a hold. I gave him $2,000. She said the number the way you say a number when you're still getting used to the size of it. I didn't say anything. I just reached across the table and put my hand over hers. "The worst part," she said, and her voice finally wavered a little, "is that I felt stupid. And then I felt angry at myself for feeling stupid, because I'm not stupid. He was just very, very good at this." "He was," I said. "That's the whole point. He does this for a living." She pulled her hand back and wrapped it around her mug again. "I asked him to leave that night after I checked. I had his things in a bag by the door. He tried to talk me out of it, very calm, very reasonable, the way he always gets. Said I was overreacting, that the database was wrong, that I was letting my sister's paranoia." She stopped. "He called it my paranoia?" "He used the word anxiety, said you had a history of catastrophizing." She looked up at me, which was interesting because he'd never met you before last weekend. That landed somewhere cold. "What did you say?" "I told him to take his bag and get out of my apartment." She almost smiled. "He left. We reported it." That part was less dramatic than it sounds. It was paperwork and waiting and a conversation at a police division that took 2 hours and left my sister exhausted. The detective who took the report was tired and kind in equal measure, told her that this kind of case was more common than people think and harder to prosecute than it should be. He took the name, both names, the civil case my husband had found, the $2,000, the dates. My husband connected us with someone he knew from his years with financial crimes, a retired investigator who consults now, who helped us organize the documentation so it was coherent and usable. He said it quietly and practically and made it easy for my sister to not feel like she was flailing. She said she appreciated that it felt like being handed something solid to hold on to. There's not a clean ending to this. The case is ongoing and slow and the outcome isn't certain. The $2,000 is probably gone. Portugal isn't happening. But my sister and I talk every day now, sometimes twice. She joined a Thursday evening pottery class in January, the kind of thing she'd always meant to do and kept putting off, and she calls me from the parking lot after every session. She's not okay, but she's okay in the direction of okay, which is something. Last week, she called me from the farmer's market, just to talk. I could hear the noise of it in the background, the carts and the vendors and the cold air, and she was telling me about a plant she'd almost bought, some kind of trailing vine that the vendor had promised was impossible to kill. "Did you get it?" I asked. "Obviously," she said. "It's on the balcony. The lights look good with it." I thought about that kitchen at my parents' house, the pierogies and the butter cake and the frost still on the back fence, the particular smallness of the moment before everything changed. My husband at the window, going quiet, me telling him to stop being a detective. I'm grateful every day that he didn't listen. I keep coming back to that moment at the kitchen window. My husband, quiet, holding his coffee, watching the frost on the back fence. He hadn't said a word yet, but something in him had already started paying attention. That's the thing about integrity, real integrity, not the kind you perform for people who are watching, but the kind that operates even when staying silent would be so much easier. He could have said nothing. We were at my dad's 70th birthday. The wine was open, the cabbage rolls were warm, my sister was laughing in the next room. The kind and frictionless thing would have been to let the evening be what it was. Nobody asked him to look, nobody would have blamed him for not looking. But that's not how it works, is it? The choices that define us aren't usually the dramatic ones. They're the quiet ones, the Tuesday night ones. The ones where you sit down at a laptop after your wife has fallen asleep and you decide that someone you care about deserves the truth, even if the truth is inconvenient, even if finding it takes 3 evenings and 2 provincial registries and a civil court index from 3 years ago. What he did took a kind of moral seriousness that I think we undercelebrate. Not bravery in the loud sense, just the willingness to be honest when dishonesty would have cost him nothing. And my sister. I think about what it took for her to confront him. She'd already built the Portugal trip in her mind. She'd already paid her share of the flights. She had $2,000 sitting out there with his name on it, letting herself see the truth clearly. After 8 months of genuine feeling, after all the careful hoping she'd done, that took a different kind of strength. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that looks like sitting across a small kitchen table and saying the number out loud and not flinching from it. $2,000. Gone. And still choosing to face what was real instead of what was comfortable. I've thought a lot about why he, the man who wasn't a doctor, was so good at what he did. He was intelligent in a narrow, practiced way. He knew exactly how much warmth to offer, exactly when to use a name, exactly how to make a question feel like an attack on the person asking it. He called my worry my sister's anxiety, framed my husband's caution as my paranoia. That reframing was a skill, and he'd sharpened it deliberately. But here's what I think. Looking back, that kind of intelligence without any moral foundation is just a very efficient way to cause harm. It doesn't build anything, it extracts. And eventually, it runs into people who are paying attention for reasons that have nothing to do with suspicion. People who are just honest and careful and willing to say a hard thing on a Saturday morning because the alternative is worse. My sister is in a pottery class on Thursday evenings now. She calls me from the parking lot after. Last week, she told me the instructor said her bowls were starting to look intentional. She laughed when she said it. It was a real laugh, not the kind she used to do when she was managing how she seemed. I think that's what comes of choosing clearly, even when it costs you. Not a clean ending, not a reward, not a guarantee. Just yourself, a little more intact, a trailing vine on a balcony, lights that look good with it. That's enough, I think. That's actually quite a lot.